So before we can solve quadratic equations, we first need to make sure that we all understand what I mean when I say quadratic equation. A quadratic equation is an equation that can be written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a, b, and c are real numbers, but a cannot equal 0. Basically, that means that your linear term and your constant term, they can be 0, but you have to have something x squared in there for it to be a quadratic equation. The first method for solving quadratic equations we're going to talk about is by factoring. And what's really important for you to understand is that to solve by factoring, you have to get the equation equal to 0 first. If it's not equal to 0, you can't solve it by factoring. That's what the zero factor theorem allows us to do. It says that if a and b are real numbers and we know that the product of a and b equals 0, then it has to be true that one of them equals 0. And that's what allows us to solve by factoring. If it equals 4 or 7 or -3, you cannot solve it by factoring. It has to be equal to 0 first to solve by factoring. So let's take a look at 2x squared minus 9x minus 35 equals 0. We would like to solve it by factoring. What we have is a quadratic trinomial whose leading coefficient is 2. What method would you like to use to solve that? Bottoms up? You guys want to factor it using bottoms up? Okay, so with bottoms up, we multiply the leading coefficient by the constant. So that would give us 1x squared minus 9x minus 70 equals 0. Then we try to factor that trinomial. Now we know that it's going to factor into two parentheses, an x and an x, and then we're going to have both positive, both negative, or one positive, one negative. One positive, one negative, because the last sign is minus. So I need two numbers that multiply to -70, but subtract to -9. So everybody take a minute and think about that. So it looks like our two factors are 14 and 5. And I would like this one to be minus, this one to be plus. Can I stop right there and set both of them equal to 0?
No.
What do I have to do? Divide back through by 2. That's what bottoms up requires us to do. Now the first factor reduces to x minus 7, and the second one doesn't reduce, so it goes bottoms up to 2x plus 5. Once I get it fully factored, you should always check to make sure that these two binomials distribute back to the original. Then you can take each factor, set it equal to 0, and solve. The first solution looks like x equals 7, and the second, we get x equals -5/2. So this quadratic equation has two solutions, -5/2 and +7. I think when you type them into WebAssign, you simply list them with a comma in between them. The second method of solving quadratic equations is by the square root property. The square root property says that if we have a square equal to a constant, that it will have two real roots. We simply take the square root of both sides and it will produce x equals the positive square root of the constant and the negative square root of the constant. So you have to remember that when you apply the square root to both sides to show a plus and a minus. Factoring doesn't work for everything. We understand that, right? Neither does the square root property. Completing the square and quadratic formula can be used on any quadratic equation, but factoring and the square root property can only be used on certain ones. They're very limited in their scope, but they're very easy when they do work. For example 2, we have x squared minus 8 equals 0. We would like to solve it using the square root property. First thing we need to do is isolate the square. So instead of x squared minus 8 equals 0, let's write that as x squared equals +8. Then we take the square root of both sides, And we have x equals plus or minus the square root of 8. But the square root of 8 will simplify to what? 2 square roots of 2. Which is our final answer. Then we can list that separately as negative 2 square roots of 2 and positive 2 square roots of 2. Example 3. Quantity x plus 4 squared equals 1. So we have a square equals a constant, and we're going to try to solve it by taking the square root of both sides. On the left, what does that equal? Right. The square root and the square, they just kind of are the inverses of each other, so they undo each other, and we get x plus 4 equals, don't forget, plus or minus the square root of 1, which in this case is just 1. Then if I subtract 4 from both sides, I have x equals negative 4 plus or minus 1. Negative 4 plus 1 equals negative 3, and negative 4 minus 1 is negative 5. So those are the two solutions to example 3.